right, we're recording. What's up, everyone? So I'm actually here with Micah, and he is a socionics enthusiast. He's been studying it for a while, and he's also really into Myers-Briggs as well, although he prefers socionics. And I think that this is going to be a really great conversation because I have been learning a lot about socionics, especially this year. And as y'all already know, I got my training from Personality Hackers Profiler Training and everything, and I've been learning a lot about Myers-Briggs. And I always thought that Myers-Briggs and Socionics were translatable. In other words, I was thinking that, hey, if I'm an ENFJ in the Myers-Briggs system, then I have to be an ENFJ in the Socionics system, right? And ENFJ in Socionics would be EIE, which is Ethical, Intuitive, Extrovert. So I thought this for years, ever since I've known about socionics. I thought about, the beta quadra and all of that. And even, I just got really into it. But I never resonated with the EIE descriptions. And even when it came to quadra values, I just always was like, okay, I was just like, all right, I guess maybe I'm that way. I don't really know. Maybe I don't really know what aristocratic even means. I did a video with Johannes one time about, this different, about socionics versus MBTI and everything. And, I was just kind of like, all right, sure. It was just something that I thought was like, well, I guess this is me. But when I'd read about the EIE in particular, there was just so many things were off. And then I started thinking hey, well, maybe it's because I'm the FE subtype. But then I'd read about it, I'm like, no, even this doesn't really sound like me. I'm not dramatic, I'm not this, I'm not that, even though they're calmer than the NI subtype EIE. And so I was actually trying to push for people to redefine or make more room for socionics descriptions so that I felt like I could fit more properly. Because there were other ENFJ who, resonated with EIE. And so then I was just confused because I was like, oh, well, why is it me? Maybe it's because I'm a 9, so maybe I'm just a 9 EIE and everything. And it was just a whole thing. So pretty much what had happened was y'all all saw my second series of when I put out the cognitive functions and me redefining them. And that was actually primed from this whole debate. So there's a whole world on Twitter, for those of you who don't know, where we were just debating and bickering and arguing. People would be using FE and then we disagree on the terms and we'd use this and we use that, and then it was just a lot of stuff. And I was seeing hold up, we are not using the same language, so we have to calibrate this. So I finally came in, and I mentioned a little bit of this on the Dave Superpowers interview for those of you who may have already seen it. I was very frustrated. My FE and TI were like, we're not agreeing on data, and so therefore there's no longer harmony. So I went and I, put out that second series where I just defined all of the cognitive functions from my perspective, from my experience, from profiling, from my expertise, all of that in my own words. And then I put it out on Twitter. World Socionics guy, Jack, he saw it. And he watched it. We did an interview on his channel. And that's when he realized, actually a lot of things that you were saying, there were some things that were kind of there and then some things that just weren't. And we started to we went from talking about, okay, how would you describe ESFJ in socionics? How would I describe ESFJ? And we started mentioning some people that we thought were ESFJ. And he's like, yeah, no, that person wouldn't be ESFJ in socionics because ABC, blah, blah, blah. And I was starting to realize that socionics and Myers-Briggs, the way that I often say it, is kind of like Spanish and Portuguese, where they sound similar enough. They're using a lot of similar language and everything. But if you're not careful, you'll get things totally mixed up. They're two different languages still. And so socionics and Myers-Briggs, even though they both came from Carl Jung, they're both rooted from there. I quickly found out that they are actually not. They're not using the same, they're using same terminology in a lot of things, but they're not using the same language for reasons I don't know 100%. We're probably going to be discussing and filleting out more of that, but that's some backstory, and the big bottom line of all of that is that Socionics and Myers-Briggs is not directly translatable. Just because you are an EIE in Socionics does not mean that you're an ENFJ in Myers-Briggs. And just because you're an ENFJ in Myers-Briggs does not mean that you're EIE in Socionics. But it also doesn't mean that you can't be. It just means that you should treat the two as two different systems. If you trust the system by itself, then you should be able to identify what type you are. And all that being said, I actually later found out that I'm an IE in Socionics, which is ENFP. And that description hit the nail on the head so hard, like even in ways that Myers-Briggs doesn't really touch on, so many different things. And that's when I started to realize, like, wow, there really is like a difference between, these things. But once again, we have ENFPs such as Joel Mark Witt, who we believe is also EIE, which is ENFJ in Socionics. And then we have Alana, who I also did a video with about atheism versus Christianity. If y'all want to check that out, she's an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, but she's also EIE. So she's ENFP in both systems. So yeah, that's a lot that I just threw at y'all. But that backstory, that foundation is something that needed to be really just laid out before we get into the deeper meat of this conversation. And do you have anything to add on to that, Micah?
I guess one thing I would add is you were talking about the kind of like similar terminology that with Socionics and MBTI, and it's something I've kind of tried to back away from. Like I know some people wonder why, maybe not with me specifically, but why I used terms like EIE instead of just saying ENFJ. Exactly. And that's, for me, that's why, because you get a certain image of like a type when you say that. And I know for the vast majority of people, and even really for me, and I'm more into Socionics than I feel like a lot of people, you're gonna come up with those MBI ideas of like what an ENFJ is. And I think you're such a good example of someone who the more we thought about it, at least, and this is just me, but I think you agree, the more I once I started, because at first I was like, okay, you have to be an EIE because you're so clearly an ENFJ. But once I kind of broke away from that, like, you being an EIE is laughable. Like, it's so, like, the similarities are just kind of shallow, where the differences are like really stark. And on the other hand, with you being an IEE, I think a lot of Myers-Briggs people, at least if they got to know you, ENFP doesn't make any sense for you, like in Myers-Briggs. Yeah. So it's just kind of, to me, one of the reasons I use the more Socionic terms, even though they might not be as popular, is because I want to stress that, okay, these two things are not necessarily the same thing. And one thing that I think has like just benefited me, you mentioned how we were bickering a lot on Twitter, is that I've kind of realized, okay, someone might say something and I'll be like, okay, that's way off. But like now, and it's Twitter, so occasionally it still happens. But now there's a lot more often somebody will say something and I'll realize, okay, no, this probably makes a lot of sense in Myers-Briggs, or I might even know it makes sense.
Right.
But it's often Socionics. And so I might respond like that. I might say, oh, hey, I think in Socionics it's this. And that's just kind of me adding to the conversation. But it doesn't irritate me in the same way of like, oh, this is just wrong. Right. And to me, it's kind of by being able to separate the systems. And I think you did a good job of saying that, like, it doesn't mean you can't be the same type. By separate, we don't mean opposite. But by separating the systems, you can have a clear idea of who you are in both systems, without relying on the other one to like kind of mess with the type.
Yeah, exactly. So with all that even being said, I know that you also now have a new YouTube channel up. And so for any of you guys who are interested, y'all should definitely go check that out. And just put up an intro video. I haven't been able to check that out yet, but I'm probably going to have you like rehash on that. Do you mind like giving a maybe brief or however much you think is necessary to introduce socionics and like how it works, just in and of itself as a system?
Sure. Try to be as brief as possible. So
And if you have,
Socionics is,
that's fine.
sorry, go ahead.
If you have to be extensive, that's also fine. I feel like my
Okay.
subscribers are used to that by now.
Okay. Um, so Socionics is a personality system, originates in Russia, and it like Myers-Briggs, it studies different types of people. One thing it differs in, as I would say, it plays a little bit more in sociology than Myers-Briggs. Um, not that not that Myers-Briggs can't, but I would say there's more of a definite area of where you can see clearly the influence on from sociology. But so one thing is like socionics, there's like four main quadras or groups that each type goes into. That's alpha, beta, delta, and gamma. And those quadras shows they share values, and that's one thing I think socionics does a good job of explaining. And I think Myers-Briggs, some people who practice it kind of fall into kind of agree with this. Some don't. I think it kind of depends on the person, from what I can tell. But it's this idea that like um, just because you value an information element doesn't mean you're strong on it. And before I continue that thought, I should probably clarify. With information elements is basically what we call cognitive functions. And I like it because it kind of emphasizes that it's information, which can come with knowledge, strength, um, and it's not necessarily how your brain is wired. Um, that's kind of debatable, but to me, it's not like a biological function. But because you can, so each quadra is a shared group of values, so, but not necessarily strengths. So, for instance, delta, let's go with delta. Um, they'll value pragmatism, which is what the nickname you've given, like extroverted thinking.
Mm.
And in Socionics, that considers effectiveness, which I think is a similarity with Myers-Briggs, but also accuracy. Like accuracy is definitely more of the extroverted thinking, and also kind of presenting facts. Where introverted thinking is more of the structure of wanting, okay, this should be done this way, this should be done this way. But delta types all value that extroverted thinking, but the strength is different. And EII is not going to be nearly as strong about that. Where and in LSD, that's one of their strongest traits. And strength doesn't just mean ability, but also understanding. So the thing with EII, it's not just that they lack an ability to do it, but it's also they have trouble understanding. Like, okay, would this be effective or would this not be? Even though they think it's important. On the other hand, um, the you can also be really good at something, really understand a source of information, and be strong at it, and not really think it's important. For you're an IEE, and one of your strongest functions is or extroverted feeling in socionics, and it's about the emotions, and kind of energizing the emotional atmosphere in the room. And I think if you watch some of your videos, that's very clear with you. You're very good at like drawing out emotion and being very coming off as very emotional yourself. But just from my interactions with you, both off in private and in public, it doesn't seem to be as much of a value for you. Where you pay way more attention on how I'm treating people, how I'm connecting with a person on a more of an individual level, and not the external emotions of the event. And so that's an example of something where you're very strong on it, but not necessarily something you find important. And one thing I think that's really cool about that is if you think of each quadrant as kind of a mini ideal society, like, in an ideal world, this is how we'd want society to run. Real life, obviously, they all conflict. That's just how the world works. You can see how each type brings different strengths to the table in order to kind of balance out the quadra as a whole. Again, with IEE, the emotional atmosphere, emotional energy, that's really important. Even if you don't value it as an element, it's something that's important. And like, so IEEs can bring that to the table for Delta. And so that's just something I think is kind of cool. And that's basically only using one example, but that's a basic brief outline of Socionics stuff.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. Cause yeah, that was one of the biggest things I realized too. Like, sorry for all that. We live right in front of a street. But one of the things that I realized really quickly was that in Myers-Briggs, I do not resonate with FI. FI, for those of y'all who are familiar with Myers-Briggs on my channel and everything, the way I define it is like getting really deeply in tune with one's own feelings, with one's own moral values, the nuance of human emotion, and kind of understanding like always like how does this make me feel? How does this make me feel? And just searching through that. But in socionics, from my understanding, it's more about your relationship, your dynamic with another person. And if I'm not mistaken, it's also called R, right?
Yeah, it's some places would, and I tend to do this too, nickname it R, which would stand for relations. Although that doesn't necessarily have to be with people, although that's usually with people, but it can also be places or things.
Mm.
One thing is that like with R, there tends to be a certain focus on mortality. Where with L, I think or laws, which is introverted thinking and socionics. I think a great example is Batman. I would say he's an LSI, and I think you can see like how he has a strict rules that he follows, like not killing the Joker. Like realistically, that's completely impractical because like it does way more damage keeping Joker alive than it doesn't. But he won't do it. And the reason he won't do it is because it's a hard rule for him. Where with when I say R, there's connection to mortality. It's very much this idea of, well, basically the golden rule of I'm going to treat someone. This is how this relationship affects me, and this is how I'd want to be affected. So I'm going to treat others this way.
Right.
And obviously, I'm kind of simplifying things because things can kind of change on type. That's one thing I've been thinking about a lot more. Is that like there's no such thing as a R type, and like every type there's an interactions between these elements. So like there's an IEE, for example, is going to be different than an SEE, even though they both have R2. But and of course that's even beyond just looking at the individual differences of people. But basically that's one way to look at it for sure.
Yeah, and that made immediate sense to me because like when I read about the IEE, one of the biggest things that they emphasized was how much like the extroverted intuition as my dominant or primary function would be me kind of like one thing specifically said it's not just about like, or it isn't even really about like, the stereotypical like, oh, what if this happens? Or what if that happens? Or like, just thinking of like random like brainstorming ideas, like how NE looks like in the Myers-Briggs system, but rather it's more about like looking at the potential of certain things. And it's mixed in even with NI. And so I thought that was a very interesting because, even though I don't value NI in Socionics, which is also different from NI and Myers-Briggs, like, Socionics NI seems a little bit more like how Myers-Briggs would define SI, with a few caveats. So that's also really interesting. There's some overlap there. But yeah, with R, or like with FI in Socionics, that one's more about, from what I've seen, your relationship with people and that dynamic, which in Myers-Briggs, that's actually FE. Or an aspect of FE. It's paying attention to your interpersonal dynamics and everything. But also in Socionics, FE is about that, that expression, that ability to be able to control the emotional temperature of the room and everything, which in Myers-Briggs, that's more of a thing that comes with FI. So in Myers-Briggs terms, like people like maybe like Tony Robbins or Russell Brand, that it kind of like, or Joe Marquette, who again is EIE and Socionics, so he's using extroverted feeling in Socionics. Like they use that inner feeling, that inner what's the word that I'm even looking for? I can't really. Passion, duh. Yeah, they use that inner passion that's heavily built within them to then like express it in a way. And then that's what makes them kind of seem like overly dramatic at times and everything, because they're speaking very passionately and very expressively in a certain fashion. And although, like you said, like I'm definitely capable of doing that, which is why it makes sense in Socionics how they talk about, being able to be good at a function but not really valuing it. Yeah, like for me, I don't really prefer to use that method. I think that my method has always been more of thought inception, which is, I guess, in its own way, could be scary for some people to hear, and probably even self-incriminating. But it's not necessarily in a way that I am on this agenda every single time that I speak to someone to change their thoughts and recalibrate it, but rather when I'm relating with people or if I'm sharing my ideas or whatever, then it's more of that exchange of that information in my relationship with these people. So not necessarily like applying a force or applying some type of emotional intensity behind anything, but rather just being like, oh, this is kind of like what makes sense to me. You can take it or leave it. I don't mind, but it's something that you should at least consider. And I'm totally open to other people doing that to me, because as we exchange these ideas, then we start, really calibrating like what we should truly believe and everything. So that was just some things that I'd like noticed, like, FI and Socionics being more about, the relational dynamic, while FI in Myers-Briggs doesn't have to do anything about the relational dynamic. That's more of an aspect or a facet of FE. But then FE in Socionics is also about, that expression and that passionate speaking and everything, which in Myers-Briggs could be FE, but is usually also found, like it's mostly found in FI, depending, there's some nuance to it that would be kind of like difficult to explain. But yeah, so that was something that I really found interesting as I started to like look more into what these functions actually meant.
Yeah, like, and then personality. I know Personality Hacker, unless they've changed this, which I don't think they have. They nicknamed introverted feeling authenticity,
Right.
and I'm a little cautious about saying this because I think authenticity has become such a high moral, almost I say moral, principle in our world. I think there's lots of types that different types that would state authenticity as a value just because of how our culture is right now.
Mm-hmm.
However, if I were to put it into a element or function in Socionics, I'd probably go with extroverted feeling or emotions, because you were talking about, and it's true, like the passion and expression. But one thing that I think can easily be misunderstood is that they want that the external state to match their internal state. And which one comes first, I would say probably depends on the time. But they're very rarely, even though they can come off as very dramatic, and they are, like E1 types or EIEs and ESEs are rarely not showcasing what they're actually feeling, even if it's a bit dramatic. A good example of the difference, honestly, might be Kanye West, just because he's such a he's such an interesting human being. He's so out there, and I mean that in every sense of the word, phrasing, in that like how he presents himself. He's such a highlighted version of this character that he almost is embodied. And I believe you typed him officially on your channel as an ENFP.
Yes.
And I could definitely see that. And to me, in Socionics, he's almost a stereotype of an EIE. And probably, if I don't know if you want to go into this, just because this is kind of slightly off topic, but we could probably go into our reasons for typing him, and we'd probably come to a lot of the same conclusions.
Sure.
Where if I were to type him as an ENFJ and MBTI, like we would be seeing something completely different, right? I don't really get that impression.
Yes. Yeah. I totally agree. In fact, there was a time when people were typing him as ENFJ on Twitter when we were discussing his type and everything. And I was like, okay, I can see how people see ISFP for sure. I can see that. I personally disagree with it, but I can see that. But like, ENFJ, what? Like, and that wasn't, I respect the guy. He's one of my favorite artists. So that wasn't me saying like, no, he's not like me. Like, I admit that people as horrible as Jim Jones and Ted Bundy, they are ENFJ in my opinion. And, so I can admit when horrible people are the same type as me. So that wasn't it. It was just a simple fact that's like, guys, no, where are you guys seeing FE with this guy? And I think that was exactly what it was. It's like his FE is coming from, how passionate he is and how much, he wants his internal state to like match the external and everything. But like I said, in Myers-Briggs, that is usually an FI quality, like completely. Now, does this mean that FE users can never do that? Not necessarily, but the way that FE users do it, I'd have to really find like an interesting way on how to compare the two. But it's almost like it's a difference between how Oprah will control the room versus how like a Tony Robbins would do so, or even in my opinion, I might get really in trouble with this one, but even Gary Vaynerchuk, like how he will like really like, just pull everybody in with this emotion that he's expressing internally, and he's kind of like amplifying it in such a way, kind of like a resonating, like he sends it out and then he has it like resonate back with him, versus maybe someone like Oprah who's able to express in a certain way, but like is kind of like controlling the crowd and amping off of their energy. So I feel like, I have to like find a better way to like explain it. But these were things that, so bringing up Kanye West, I was just like, what are we talking about? And now that I know that, there's a distinction between the two, it's like, I can totally see Kanye West as an EIE. I can definitely see that, like, easily. ENFJ, no. But yeah, EIE for sure. I could see that. And so makes it like really helpful.
The funny thing about like with Kanye West, like with EIEs, they have strong R, but it's ignoring. And this is actually something that like I've been recently very interested in, because with the ignoring function, it's a strength that can easily be perceived as a weakness, because you kind of repress it, maybe not in a literal psychological sense, but you kind of repress it in favor of your leading function or element. And so if we kind of see the comparisons, not straight translations, but comparisons between FE and R, the fact that like even like he has it in a way that could be perceived as a weakness in Socionics, which again makes then to turn around and say he's ENFJ just kind of weird. Mm-hmm. And I think like you can just like look at like some of his most famous moments where he's like clearly completely dismissing his like how this something's going to affect his relationships with someone in favor of like energizing a crowd and stuff like that. And I mean, I agree. If you look at that data, just take away type for a second, just look at the data. ENFJ makes no sense for him.
Yeah,
like I easily see why you'd be confused by that.
Yeah, and it was stuff like that that made me really bitter against Socionics, because then it's kind of like, like with astrology, when people are like, Denzel, you're a Sagittarius? That means, and it's like, what do you think Sagittarius means? Because even though I may not agree with it, I have to know what you are projecting onto me without even knowing me before, whatever. And I feel like that's how a lot of people probably feel about type. And that's why it's so important to like know what certain functions actually mean, the nuance of different types. Like even now, like as I'm doing the celebrity typing and everything, you know, people are commenting like, you know, there's an ongoing conversation on my ENFJ, how to identify an ENFJ both in real life and in fiction video, where someone literally said, I don't think that, you know, Professor Xavier is an ENFJ because ENFJs are usually pushy and not as introspective and stuff like that. And I was like, what? And then I asked him, do you think that I'm pushy? And then the person responded back like, well, if you're an ENFJ, you should be. And I'm like, where are we coming up with this stuff? Like, and there was somebody else who like, you know, commented, and it's like, and if I didn't know better, then it's like, you know, then I'd start thinking like, maybe I'm actually INFJ. And then it makes me wonder like, how many other ENFJs are out there, you know, who are thinking that they're INFJ because of these types of stereotypes. And so like, we have to better know the differences and the nuances, because there are definitely ENFJs who are pushy and stuff like that, and there are also those who are not, and these shouldn't disqualify the type. We should be aware of those nuances. And so knowing what you may classify in each system can also help. But then at the same time, and I think that you and I both agree, like we shouldn't overlap the system or use the system as an excuse. If you can fully, you should be able to type out as your accurate type in either system without the help of the other. And so if you're an ENFJ, then even if you had no idea what socionics was, you should be able to resonate with the ENFJ description. If you're an EIE, you should be able to resonate with the EIE description, even if you don't know what ENFJ is, kind of thing. But once you start like, you know, mixing the systems in a manner that's like, well, you know, I'm just a strange EIE because in Myers-Briggs I'm this, then that's when you kind of like start muddying the waters, and that's not what I'm trying to promote here.
Yeah. Also, I had to say the pushiness. I guess that could be potentially EIE instead of ENFJ. But the introspective thing, is that true for any? I feel like that's just like a stereotype about extroverts. Like I could be wrong, but like that's the only time I've heard that about like ENFJs or EIEs. I think both types are very introspective.
Yeah.
But like one thing that I think you've already kind of stressed, but I kind of want to clarify just because I think it's something I see confused so often. The differences between Myers-Briggs and Socionics are sometimes small but important. And what I mean by that is there's elements of maybe the functions that are the same. But the problem is they're not all the same.
Right.
Some of them are very different. Some of them are slightly different. And also some of them, they have like different elements to it. Like for instance, extroverted thinking, I think has to do with effectiveness in both systems.
Right.
But accuracy, at least with the personality hacker, they tend to connect it more towards introverted thinking,
Right.
where and Socionics is much more to do with extroverted thinking.
Yeah.
But also just like, again, these, they don't exist in isolation. So for instance, I would say an ESE, why not being the same thing, is closer to an ESFJ than an ENFJ is to EIE. And that's because it's not just the E or emotions, but the S, which I've seen different nicknames. I think my favorite one right now is stability, or homeostasis, comfort. If I were to say harmony, if I were to label harmony as a function in Socionics, it would be S. And so you'll have ESEs who are going to be more generating this emotional effect in order to create harmony or comfort with a group, which does kind of fit more of the extroverted feeling of Socionics. But for EIEs, that's arguably their worst function.
Right.
And so I was going to say an example, but I'm not sure I should. But an EIE, depending on the individual, of course, if they are wanting to motivate someone, they're much more likely to be very pushy and try to like, I'm gonna and maybe even amplify negative emotions of like, hey, what's wrong with you? You need to do this.
Yeah.
Um, and it's because they're not as interested in creating this harmony atmosphere. So
Right.
it's again, the problem isn't just that they're opposites. It's that there's so many small differences and complications that add up to the point where you could be someone who's the same type in both systems, but it's just going to confuse you
Yeah.
and lead to mistyping, whether it's you or someone else you know.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes total sense. And it even reminds me how, so my ISFP wife, Jamila, she's an ISFP in Myers-Briggs for sure. But then in Socionics, I thought, well, no, again, when I thought it was translatable, I'm like, okay, so that means that she must be ESI, right? ESI?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then when we finally decided to read about it, we were like, it's like I don't think this is her. And she's like, yeah, I don't really resonate. And I was like, I mean, maybe. And we were trying to get her to like fit. I was like, maybe because you're this or blah, blah, blah. Like, if you feel like you have to be like maybe this, maybe that. That's when I found that no, that's just not the type. And so finally, it was like just a few weeks ago. You actually put out a test on the Quadras or something. No, you said it was from World Socionics, but
Yeah, it's a World Socionics quiz that he's working on right now. It's not finished, but I think it's pretty good overall.
mhm.
Um, like any tests, not everyone's getting the right result, and it's still a work in progress. But as far as tests go, I think it's one of the better ones in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And in a moment, I'm actually going to ask you, after you comment on whatever I'm about to say, to define alpha, beta, quadra, alpha, beta, delta, gamma, all of that, best that you can in a way. But yeah, so we took that test and I scored delta. And I didn't even know what the test was. Like you just you were just like, hey, can you guys just take this test? It's like 5 minutes. I'm like, okay. And I just kind of thoughtlessly did it. And I just answered. I didn't really know 100% what it was going to be. And then when I got the results, it was like, you were a Delta Quadra. I was like, oh, this is a Socionics Quadra. And then I read about it. I'm like, yeah, that fits for sure. And then when I was like, oh, I wonder what Jamila's gonna get. So I had her take it, and she showed me she got Alpha Quadra, and I was like, interesting, because ESI is in the Gamma Quadra, and so I was like, okay, Alpha. I wonder if you're an SEI, which is ISFJ, but not necessarily ISFJ in Socionics. And we started reading it, and both of us like even from like the first paragraph, we were like, yeah, like this is her. And that was just so interesting for me because, again, like sensing or SI in Socionics having to do more with the harmony and things like that, that really made so much sense because like for her, she is she doesn't necessarily bring harmony in the sense that like in Myers-Briggs FE would try to do, but she's more just like a super chill person. Like she's just really relaxed. Like just being around her, you'll feel at peace. And that's kind of like how I described her. It also talked about how like she has a very high, she loves aesthetics and like sensory pleasures, all of that. And that is, in Socionics, in Myers-Briggs, is more attributed to SE, especially SEFI. But in Socionics, this is SI. And so looking at these distinctions of what Socionics SI is versus what Myers-Briggs SI is, and then even SE in Socionics versus Myers-Briggs SE, it's just been continuing to like open up like a whole world of differences for me. And then even like one thing that I was just going to read real quick, like earlier I was talking about the difference in extroverted intuition from a socionic standpoint, at least for an IEE, versus extroverted intuition from a Myers-Briggs standpoint. So this blurb that I'd found completely resonated with me. I'll try to like read through it quickly. IEs feel more comfortable expressing their views, opinions, and experience to people they have established a personal, trusting connection with than informal discussions where people may criticize their ideas and formulations and ignore their good intentions and personal experience. Totally true. When IEs focus on presenting information in an impersonal, systematic manner, they often appear over-controlled and uptight. When they let themselves focus on the vision and experience of what they are describing, or freely jump from aspect to aspect of the subject, the quality of their ideas actually increases, and they do a better job of captivating their audience. So true. IEs show interest in abstract ideas that have great explanatory potential. However, once they have assimilated the ideas, they are better at talking about personal experience and observation related to the ideas rather than the logical content or structure of the ideas themselves. They avoid using new categories or systems until they can see worthwhile applications to people's lives and belief systems. And the last part, IEs prefer to examine people's individual reasons for their behavior rather than judge behavior through the lens of systems of rules or concepts, which is introverted logic approach, or judge the person based on how well he or she satisfies other people's demands, SE approach. IEs assume that people's behavior always has an objective root in their past, their upbringing, or their internal makeup. They cannot condemn a person for what he was programmed to do by his past or his personality. However, they condemn people who ignore any insights and understanding that they feel should be obvious to everyone. Each type tends to harshly criticize, blah, blah, blah. Dang, I think I kind of like missed it, but there was pretty much a part where it said that extroverted intuition for the IEE is not necessarily like, again, like just coming up with a whole bunch of ideas about something, but it's more so like, IEs easily think in terms of what could happen or what might have been. They easily imagine how things, situations, relationships, events could be different from a critical factor or even or event where added. This allows the model, dang, I really can't find it, and I'm sad about that. But
Is it the one about like oh, maybe I should ride a bike to work thing?
yeah, that one. So I'm trying to
Like,
yeah.
like instead of just being like, oh, what if aliens ruled the world? What would life be like? It's more of like alternatives, like things like, oh, should I maybe do a bike? Like it'd be like, okay, to use that example, like, oh, maybe I should ride a bike to work today, and then like thinking of, okay, what would be the potential of that, and how would that grow into okay, this could happen. Okay, yeah, no, I think I'm gonna do this.
Exactly.
Um, I've also noticed that like with people who have strong or sometimes value, but definitely just strong extroverted intuition and socionics. They also do that a lot of times. They do this with people, especially I would say more of the um, to use my own terms, feelers,
Mhm.
in the sense of like, okay, what's this person's potential, and kind of wanting to, especially if it's somebody they're interested in, or I
Yes.
guess they feel a connection to, of wanting to broaden that potential.
Yeah.
Um, I guess in theory, a potential negative of this would be seeing someone for their potential
Mhm.
and not for who they really are.
Right.
I would say, but the positives of this are obvious. Able to like really develop this person into becoming and who they could be,
Mhm.
and also even I'm talking about other people, but even yourself of like, oh, I want to um, develop into this kind of person and seeing it. One thing I would say there's a lot of also like knowledge
Mhm.
seeking when it comes to NE and Socionics. Not just facts, which I would say is more extroverted thinking, or
Yeah.
like trying to know something that's practical, but more of like seeing, okay, this area or field has potential, and I can see how it could develop and grow
Yes.
as a person, really, even um, if I do this. And so there's almost it's more of I'm gonna learn for learning's sake in a way. But again, like I think World Socionics has extrovert intuition nicknamed as ideas. I think you could also, even though it's very doesn't work quite as well because we have pragmatism for extroverted thinking, but I think you could also just name it potential.
Yeah.
Um, I think it works really well. And interestingly, for you specifically, delta types, one of the characteristics of them is like very much into like this idea of like self-help and self-development. They're one of the like, there's like different complexes that I've read about that I really enjoy when it comes to each quadra. And for the delta one, the nickname that it's given is clipped wings, and it's the idea that like they don't like the idea of you saying, "Oh, you can't develop or grow or evolve in this way." They
Right.
want to be continually growing and changing. And I think that could even be a potential problem when typing deltas, is because you want to say, okay, this is your weak area. This is your place where you're going to start struggle with. And I think this is me kind of theorizing. A lot of delta types might kind of take that and be like, oh no, I can handle this. I'm going to outgrow this. And it's because they find such importance in I'm going to develop into a better person, and not just morally, but more like a superior version of themselves.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm doing the best way of expressing it, but I do. That's kind of what it is for Delta, and I think a lot of that. There's definitely some pragmatism to it, but I think a lot of it has to do with the potential of seeking of extroverted intuition.
Yeah, yeah, that I think that was like nail on the head right there because a lot of what you're just explaining now that shows like how like for me I would have attributed that in Myers-Briggs to NI. Like I always talk about how I have become very good everywhere that I look. All I see are seeds. And I talk about it a lot on Twitter. I talk about it a lot on my channel. Like that's the analogy that I probably beat with the horse. But it's like I uh, how did I just forget the phrase? Like it's a dead.
I'm just imagining you beating it with like a horse, like holding a.
Wow, that's hilarious.
I don't care. I like it better that way. Let's keep it.
Yeah, so I beat it with a horse. But no, seriously though, like that's the analogy that I really just keep on nailing because I see seeds everywhere and I'm seeing the potential everywhere. As soon as I see a friend or a dynamic or relationship, which would be FI in socionics, and I'm looking at, okay, where could this dynamic or this relationship actually go? You know, is this going to be worth the water that I'm going to be putting onto this seed? Or is this going to grow into something that's probably not going to nourish me enough? And if that's the case, then I should not expend too much energy onto that seed. And then that's how I also see not only myself, you know, like trying to build myself up to become the best version of myself, but also helping other people. Like I talk as a like personal life coach and everything, personal development coach. I often refer to myself as the Professor Xavier of personality types. And I wrote this whole story, this whole blog, pretty much talking about how the same way that Professor Xavier sees people's superpowers, and he's like, hey, I can teach you from being able to pick up just maybe a nickel and a microwave and a TV with your magnetic powers to being able to pick up a whole football stadium. And then you can use that to help society. And so for me, I see the same way where with our cognitive functions, there's superpowers. And I'm just like, hey, I can help you learn how to use your FE from just being able to maybe like charm people and stuff to now actually being able to, you know, influence people in a way that'll help them to become better assets to society. I can help you with your FI so that, you know, instead of just like, you know, looking at what you like and everything, being able to amplify that to make people feel what you're feeling, you know, speaking from a Myers-Briggs standpoint, of course, because that's more FE and socionics, but yeah. So yeah, like that definitely fits. And then just like I was saying again, like with Jamila, you know, she being SEI in socionics, all of that also makes sense, especially when you look at, you know, the people who are typed as SEI in socionics, like Bob Ross. And it's like we always compare Jamila to Bob Ross and stuff. And so But again, that doesn't mean that ISFJs in Myers-Briggs cannot also be SCI and Socionics. Like you'll have lots of overlap, and you'll probably even have ESFJs who may type out as SCI and Socionics. And so that's why we really want to stress that it's best to find out what your type is in the system, almost as if you did not know about the other system. So if you're already like into Socionics, then if you're going in to find out what your Myers-Briggs type is, it's best to pretend as if you don't even know anything about Socionics and you just learn all about Myers-Briggs and like by itself. And then the reverse for Myers-Briggs, like, if you're going into Socionics to find out what type you are, don't try to use your prior knowledge of what FE is and everything, because that'll screw you over. Instead, just like come in as if you don't know anything, learn from there. And I feel like that's essentially the biggest thing that we're trying to harp on in this video. Did you have anything to add on to that?
Just two thoughts just right off the top of my head. One thing is that like I'm pretty sure Myers-Briggs extroverted sensing is one thing. It's very aware of your environment,
Mm-hmm.
and being kind of in tune to that. Where I think in Socionics I'd probably put that more as introverted sensing. Sherlock Holmes I would say is LSE, at least in the original book, and he is very aware of his environment, and I would say he values introverted sensing and Socionics. The other thing I was gonna say is, I get that it might not be easiest. This might not be the easiest way to do things to completely separate the systems,
Right.
because you can't. It's not. I don't want it to be you guys to think that we're just kind of assuming, oh, it's easy to like completely forget what you know and just jump into a different system. It's definitely a little bit more difficult, but in the long run, not only is it, in my opinion, more accurate, but it's more rewarding if you do it that way.
Right.
Um, and so it's again, I understand that like it might not be easy, and you might have to like kind of it might be something you have to work on. Like, oh, okay, I accidentally brought some bias into this. I need to rethink it. But if you're looking for more accurate information and also wanting to understand it in a more accurate way that doesn't go into without inserting things into it that might not be true,
Mm-hmm.
and just better understanding overall, I think this is the best way to go about it. And I'll even say this. I would say this even if I thought the systems are translatable, which I don't. And again, I don't think I think there's many problems with translating the systems one to one.
Mm-hmm.
But if you disagree, my thought is, okay, then it should be really easy to find your type, but still do them separately.
Yeah.
And if you do them separately and you come up with the same type every time, with like not just with you is what I mean, but like with other people, and it always translates, good. It was easy, but at least you don't have to worry about like filtering all that data through your own biases from another system. Beyond just Myers-Briggs and Socionics, I mean that with like say Enneagram. It's very easy for people to take an Enneagram type and think, oh, that translates to an MBT type, MBTI, Myers-Briggs type. And while there are some similarities between these types, you're not going to get the full effectiveness of each system
Mm-hmm.
unless you kind of treat them on their own and come to a conclusion separately. That's just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah. Yo, that's perfect. That's great. Well, just to also wrap this up, would you mind listing the values to the best of your ability between all of the quadras, just in case if someone wants to? This isn't end all be all for those of you who listen and immediately resonate with the quadra, but this is just to maybe give you an idea, maybe like which temperament to start with, and then kind of like search from there if you want, or just to at least even have knowledge of like what each quadra values. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to do kind of a brief overview. Um, so I'm gonna skip unless you would rather me not, I'm thinking I'll probably skip delta for now since I've kind of already used that as an example. Um, yeah, yeah, I think there's I think I pretty much went over all of delta. Have I?
I think so, but I guess would it hurt just to like
No, no.
yeah, just in case if somebody's like super new to this and they still just kind of like need like, oh wait, I didn't like get all of that.
Okay, so delta. Um, I'm just gonna work backwards because why not? Delta is a quadra that values extroverted thinking. I'm just gonna use these terms to make it easier. Extroverted thinking, um, introverted feeling, introverted sensing, and extroverted intuition. So extroverted intuition, you kind of already talked about ideas, potential, um, and all that. Extroverted thinking, pragmatism, which can include effectiveness, accuracy, facts, in terms of just kind of learning facts and wanting to be as accurate as possible with them. Um, Introverted sensing is kind of this more harmonious, comfortable homeostasis is one way to put it. Um, and introverted feeling is kind of the relations between um, people, and also like where an extroverted function is more like broadcasting. An introverted feeling, there is some kind of check on like it's an introverted filter. So with relations, it's also going to be like how does this relationship affect me, especially for the ones that are leading. Again, it'd be a little bit different with IEEs than EIIs, but there's still kind of like this introverted filter. And then gamma, they share some qualities with delta. There's the extroverted thinking, this idea of pragmatism, um, introverted feeling with like relations, but then there's extroverted sensing and intuition, introverted intuition. With introverted intuition, it's usually nicknamed time and kind of, but I think World Socionics has recently nicknamed it telos, or I have no idea how you're supposed to pronounce it, but whatever. And it's kind of this idea of like purpose and meaning, and not so much as goals. One thing about introverted intuition is that it's the way it is it's not so much as I'm gonna reach this goal, but more of like the journey getting to it. And so you could have like an introverted intuition type who isn't the best at planning out like what they're gonna do, but they have this very okay, I have this long term purpose and meaning to life and kind of worldview. Um, and you'll have types like even who are in gamma like SEEs who are really weak at this, but they appreciate people who can kind of help bring their actions to this greater picture, this greater meaning. And extroverted sensing is, I would say, pretty different than Myers-Briggs, in that it's very much about power dynamics, and impact and influence. World Socionics, I know, and I think Glinko, who's the guy from Russia that they took some of these nicknames from, they nickname it force, which I have mixed feelings about right now, but it's accurate overall. But it can also be like it doesn't have to be like physical force. It can also be like political influence. Um, Donald Trump, I think, is an example of someone who's very strong in this. I don't know if he's gamma. He might be beta, but either way, he's somebody who you can easily see like very in tune to power dynamics and like kind of exploding weaknesses and stuff. Um, and one thing that to keep in mind for like um, extroverted sensing leading types in socionics, the easy easy thing to do would be to assume, okay, find someone who just jumps into a fight without thinking and he gets clobbered. He's somebody who's very in tune to that, this idea of force and power and stuff. And honestly, I'd probably say though somebody who does that is more likely to be an EIE or LIE, someone who's flexing it but not actually very aware of it. Because again, and this is why thinking about this information is so important. Someone who is an extroverted sensing leading type in socionics is going to be very aware of the power they have versus the power like someone else's have. So somebody who like more likely someone who who jumps into a fight and just obviously gets clobbered isn't going to be one of those people, because they would be so much more aware of, okay, I can't win this fight, and so I'm going to choose more carefully. I think World Socionics there's a profile on the blog where Marlon Brando is typed as an SOE, which is extroverted sensing leading type. And one thing you can notice, and they point out, and you can look at his life and see, is it how he's super hard to handle and rebellious when he's like in a position of power, but when he's kind of started, his reputation's kind of gotten bad and he's kind of lost some of that influence in Hollywood, will behave really well. And it's because he's very aware of how much power he has. And I kind of mentioned this idea of complexes before, Delta type, and how this idea of self-development and stuff. I can't remember what the nickname of it, but for gammas, it's this idea of wanting to be free to like act like physically. Capitalism is very much a gamma concept. It's not necessarily, I'm not necessarily saying everyone who believes or disbelieves in it, please don't type yourself on whether you're pro-capitalist, but as a concept in itself, it's very gamma. Beta, they have that same influence on power dynamics, with extroverted sensing, meaning and overarching purpose, with introverted intuition, but also they have extroverted ethics or extroverted feeling, and introverted logic. And so extroverted feeling, we've kind of gone over a lot in this video, but it's basically like this emotional energy or emotional atmosphere, very much tied to self-expression, and some authenticity. And intuitive intuition is very much like kind of laws. It's very structure and system matter of thinking. I think with beta types, they can be very much, they're a lot of times they're very interested in enforcing these laws and rules, because it's a combination of the force and laws of introverted logic. And also with beta types, they tend to be the most traditionally aristocratic group. Deltas can also be aristocratic, but it's in a completely different way. The traditional idea of aristocratic is very much beta, and so it's very important for them, like when it comes to like hierarchy. That's very important, and it's not so much that they're consciously classifying everything in a hierarchical sense, but more of that's just their natural way of viewing the world. Like a lot of beta types, they'll just kind of see it as there's a natural hierarchy, and it's just better to be higher up than lower up. And so for them, for beta types, there's this complex and being seen as this weaker. And weak is less about, it doesn't have to be traditional idea weak, but really just lower on this hierarchy, and the desire to like kind of push themselves to be higher up and stronger. And organization idea beta, maybe not as much in modern times, I'm not sure, but especially in the kind of the medieval area, the Catholic Church is very beta. Alphas share that extroverted feeling and extroverted feeling and introverted logic, and they combine that with like the delta idea, or delta, what I mentioned before, delta with extroverted intuition and introverted sensing, and that's why you can have a little bit more desiring for harmony, whether that's with ESEs or even ILEs, although they're not going to be quite as good at keeping the harmony, because they have very weak introverted sensing. But they're also about like discussing different ideas and seeking. Marvel, if you like the Marvel films, overall, there's some differences per movie, but I would say overall, it seems very alpha to me, of just kind of energizing the crowd and kind of just having a good time. They don't go into too dark of territory. Even, I'm not saying there's not some dark moments in the MCU, but overall, if you look at it, it's a very light-hearted series, and kind of they explore different ideas. But so to me, it's personally, I would say that's very alpha. And where gammas are very concerned about being able to do stuff, like don't keep me in chains, metaphorically speaking, I want to jump out and do stuff. For alphas, it's about speaking. And so for alphas, one of the most important things is the idea of freedom of speech, because they want to be able to say whatever, like no, they want to be able to say um, whatever is on their mind, and it's kind of free expression. Of course, there's kind of like there's certain things that the alpha types would prefer you to talk about. I'm generally a bit more comforting than say a beta type. But overall, it's very important for them to like have this freedom of self-expression, and that's kind of their complex. I think it's the complex of closed mouths. Like, don't close my mouth. And so that's kind of there's more to it, but that's kind of like very brief overlap of each quadra.
Yeah, yo, that was great, man. Thanks so much, and thanks again for even taking the time out of your day, out of your week, to come and do this video with me. I really appreciate it. And
That's fun.
shout out your Twitter and the YouTube channel and everything. I'm also going to try and link it in the description for you guys to be able to check it out. But yeah, just tell us like what you're about to put on there, and what are you up to on Twitter? Anything that you need to just shout out as we outro.
Just like what I'm doing on YouTube right now, or
Yeah, YouTube, Twitter, or anything that you feel like, where people can find you if they want to talk to you, ask questions.
Twitter would probably be the best place to do it. YouTube is just kind of YouTube's interesting because basically my thought was um, it'd be another way for me to kind of share this interest of mine. Um, it'll kind of give me an area where I can collaborate with people some more, since I've already kind of doing this right now. But like this is just an example. I've been kind of collaborating with more people when it comes to videos. And also just kind of gain confidence behind like a camera and stuff.
Yes.
And kind of speaking and just speaking in general. And so I don't really know. I'll probably keep most of my videos. This could change eventually, obviously, but most of my videos Socionics wise, but I'm not quite sure what I'm gonna address specifically. It might depend on my mood.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes sense. So his Twitter is Literary Jungian. So that's LITERARYJUNGIAN, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, y'all check him out. Ask him any questions on there. He's always up for discussion. Just come at him respectfully. That's my thing, But yeah, just come at him respectfully and let's further discuss. So yeah, thanks again, Micah, for joining us on here. And thank y'all for watching. Done.